Hello, this is episode 19 of Audiovisual Cultures, coming to you this week straight after double screenings at the Tyneside Cinema in Newcastle upon Tyne. I'm Paula Blair, and Andrew, Shail and I are conducting a bit of an experiment tonight. We've each been to see two different films on at the same time. This was initially because Andrew had at first decided to see Solo, the latest in the Star Wars franchise. I couldn't be less interested, frankly, especially as the previous two Star Wars offerings have featured some really great women characters in heroic roles. Today, that's really what I need to say. It's the 25th of May 2018, and Ireland is having a referendum, which, as we're recording, is in its last 25 minutes of polling. And this is on repealing the 8th Amendment to its constitution, which denies safe legal abortion to people who need to end pregnancies. And today I really need to see women being heroes, and that's what we both ended up doing, I think. I went to see The Rape of Recy Taylor, a documentary about a young black woman who spoke out after being abducted by 7 white teenage boys and raped by 6 of them in Abbeville in Alabama in 1944. Civil rights activist and chief investigator for the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, that's the NAACP, Rosa Parks, was sent, and the film details the growing demand for justice that rose out of this. Meanwhile, instead of seeing Solo, Andrew opted for Edie. I'll let Andrew tell you all about that and why he changed his mind, and we'll see if we can pull any useful comparisons together from these films.
Why did I want to see Edie? Well, I saw the trailer and figured, I will see Solo, a Star Wars story at some point. But having seen the trailer for Edie, I thought, okay, my desire to see this in cinemas is far in excess of my desire to see Solo in cinemas. We managed to see films which started almost exactly the same time, lasted for almost exactly the same amount of time, and therefore came out at almost exactly the same time as well. Tell me about what you saw.
The Rape of Recy Taylor is a really incredible documentary based on and inspired by a scholarly historical monograph by a historian in the United States, Danielle Maguire. It details what happened to Recy that night, and it does it in a really interesting way because it uses footage from a set of films that were labelled as race films, because these were very similar to the black press at the time, where they were made by black people for black people telling black stories. And a lot of these films were dealing with the rapes and lynchings that were happening regularly in the Deep South and the general maltreatment of black people who were descended from former slaves. So a lot of these images were used to help illustrate and piece together that night, as well as contemporary footage of the area of the house that Recy had grown up in and where her family was still living at the time, and the woods where it's thought that these boys took her. There's also a lot of interviews with her younger sister and brother, and her brother especially was only a baby when their mother died, and she basically became his mother. Even what happened to his sister had a tremendous effect on him. He's been an activist about this for so much of his life as well. There's quite lengthy interviews with them, as well as some actors on voiceovers reading the testimonies of the boys at the time, a little bit about their lives. There's a couple of them, their younger brothers, talk about them a bit because they had little awareness of what was going on, and of course they're in this white privilege bubble, so they talk about being friends with the Negroes and that sort of thing, and their fathers beating the boys, but they never really knew why. And then about them ending up going off to, because this happened in the earlier part of 44, and most of them were 17, and then by the next year they're off to war. They join the Navy and they go off to war. They became war heroes. They mainly fought in the Korean War or police action, whatever you want to call it, in the early 1950s. They ended up becoming decorated war heroes. Some of them were caught and ended their lives in prisoner of war camps. So there's a bit about them because Recy was able to identify every one of them. She knew them. It was 7 of them lifted her, so it details the story. She'd been at church. She had a baby daughter at the time. She was married. She was 24 years old. She was a very strong Christian. She barely got to go to church anymore because she had the baby, and that night she was desperate to go, and her husband said, "I'll mind the baby, you go to church." It was when she came out of church, these boys were prowling around in a car looking for a woman to rape. The ones that they originally wanted, the whole family put up resistance, so they moved on and they singled her out, lifted her, blindfolded her. They had a gun, threatened her, took her to this woodland and forced her into giving consent, basically with a gun to her head and offering her money. The way the historians put it in the film, they just felt this entitlement to access a black woman's body, and they didn't see a person. They didn't see, she was begging them. She was telling them that she was a mother. She had to get back to her baby. She had a husband. The boys later claimed that she was a prostitute and she was willing to do it, and she was obviously incredibly traumatised. It went to court. She did speak up about it. She told her family immediately what happened. Her father was really angry about it. I think the rest of his days it seemed like he had a shotgun, and whether it was loaded or not, his children didn't think it ever was, but he had the shotgun as a symbol, and he had it out the front porch constantly. Never would have used it, only for the trouble it would have caused the rest of the family. I mean, Recy and her husband ended up getting burnt out of their own house because she'd spoken up about everything. She moved back in with her family home. She never had any other children. It wasn't clear exactly what happened, but the words and the reportage of it, and the reportage was only ever in the black press. It was never in mainstream media, but it was reported widely nationally in black press, and that's what helps get momentum for the court cases. That she was raped and ruptured, which just sounds horrifically violent and painful, because 6 of these 7 boys forced themselves on her, one after the other. The youngest was 14 and apparently just didn't. I think he was so racist he wouldn't touch her, was the impression. That wasn't what was said, but that was the impression I was getting. Either that or he was scared because he was so young, I don't know, but he wouldn't do anything. But he was certainly a witness. Rosa Parks got involved. What an incredible woman. The police chief who was investigating, when Recy's family reported her missing, he apparently was prowling around looking for her, but they didn't think that he was really looking. They bumped into him when she'd come back to them, and he took her statements and everything, and he knew the boys. It turned out much later in the film that one of them happened to be his nephew by marriage. The really heartbreaking thing was they have the same name. His name is the same as her family name, which is Corbett, and it's revealed that historically his family had owned her ancestors, and that's where they got their name from. There's this legacy there, and the legacy of slavery is everywhere through this. It's just this ownership specifically and access at any time to black women's bodies. It was pretty harrowing stuff, but it's also a documentary that is energising because it's not about the trauma or the tragedies. It's about the strength and the resilience of these people, that they kept fighting. So Rosa Parks got involved. She came, the police chief told her to get out of town. She did. She came back 2 weeks later. The same, he pretty much assaulted her, dragged her out of the house and told her to go away. Again, she left. She came back. This is the woman who would not give up her seat on the bus. That's only one of the many amazing things that she did. With her help, they brought it to court, and of course it didn't get anywhere because who was on the jury? Well, it was a load of white men who were of this community who were often related to these boys, so of course nothing happened. And of course, if it had been a white woman, something might have been done about it. But even still, I mean, you read all the stories about Hollywood historically that have come out, and even then I don't think anything would really have happened. It's just the sense that it's a black woman, so she's not even human. It's really angering. The documentary details this history from a range of viewpoint. I mean, there's a couple of women academic historians in there. So there's Danielle Maguire, who wrote the book that this is from, but there was also
Crystal Feimster,
an associate professor at Yale, and herself is a black woman, and from the accent I think was from possibly somewhere in the south as well. She was speaking from the point of view as a historian, but also very emotionally as a black woman. So they were giving these really robust accounts of the histories, but also from a revisionist point of view, where they've been seeking out the stories that have been suppressed for decades. And it was really interesting because I suppose in an attempt to balance, there was a local amateur historian was consulted, and it actually emerges quite late on in the film that, you know, when it comes back to him a second time, this guy, I can't remember his name, but he was bringing up the apologist for white supremacist side of things, and I don't know if it was fully intentional, but he was too scared to say anything. Certainly he was talking around stuff. He was sort of saying things like boys being boys and that sort of attitude, but also the second time he's in the film, he says something about not being able to say anything because people are still alive. Reading between the lines and reading his, well, it was a very tight close-up, but a lot of the sort of talking heads parts were very tight close-ups, and it was in that very soft focus, you know, where the sharp focus is all in the face, just the face, and everything else is blurred. And it was very often unflattering in a lot of ways. Somebody like him, who you could see so much, his face was telling a different story to his mouth and that he's saying, I can't say stuff because there are people still alive. I was getting such a strong sense that he knew the truth and he wasn't prepared to say anything, name names. He was saying the word allegedly a lot to cover himself because the guys were never convicted. They went to court twice and they were never convicted. They got off, but he was not prepared to stand by it and call it what it was, a gang rape. They have to live here, I have to live here. You know, he's looking out for himself. He doesn't, maybe he's got a lot to lose, but he didn't seem to be interested in the justice side of anything. And Recy did get an official apology from the governor at the time in 2011. This is a substantial amount of time.
Nearly 60 years.
There were quite a few photographs of her shown, and even some home video stuff much later in her life, and even as a young woman with her daughter. And it's a good couple of years because there were photographs being taken. It stayed in the black press for a long time. It kept current and it spread right across the country. There were rallies for her in Brooklyn. She was known about, but her story faded in time because it lost in court twice, and new cases were coming up because this was happening constantly. So new cases were coming up, so there was a constant fight for somebody else, but she was largely forgotten about after that. But there was a bit of footage towards the end of the film of her more recently. She only died 6 months ago in December 2017 at the age of 98.
And was the production of this film something to do with her having died?
Well, it was being made. So the film came out last year. It was directed by Nancy Buirski, who, interestingly, she's been a producer on more films than she's directed, but she's directed quite a few. People may have heard of Loving, which was a fictionalisation of a documentary that came out a few years ago, 2011, called The Loving Story, which she produced. It's about an interracial couple in the 1940s against the backdrop of really aggressive anti-miscegenation. This married couple who had children, the Lovings, who really had a battle to fight for their love. and the safety of them and their family. And so this is somebody who cares very much. Actually, when I was reading about her earlier today, she reminded me quite a bit of Kim Longinotto, who had visited Newcastle last year and who has made films as well about black women's experiences in Chicago, the young women who get sucked into sex work unwillingly and get hooked on drugs by pimps and that sort of thing, and dream catchers. So the documentary, I think, was in the process of being made because Recy had since died. It's possible that the title was maybe added in, but I'm not too sure because its official release date was 2017 and she died just in December. But also her sister Alma, who speaks quite a lot in the film, died in 2016. So this is a film I think has been a few years in the making. It's been gathering steam for quite a while because it's not an easy story to tell, and it's a story that makes a lot of people uncomfortable for that reason, that people are still alive. And coming where I come from, I understand this tension all too well, this frustration. There's a really interesting mix. I mean, I'm interested in films, especially documentaries that are infused with archival materials. There's a lot of mixture of all the kinds of approaches used in documentary films. So there's elements of reconstruction, through existing fictional films from the period, the race films that are dealt with, because I think that's a whole area of study in itself. These films, I wouldn't have known they existed otherwise. And some really harrowing images from those, really very graphic films of these men just grabbing at these women because they feel entitled to access them. Also, there's quite a bit of archival footage and audio clips. There are times when, even when it's the talking head thing, there are times when it's asynchronous, so you'll be hearing, for example, her younger brother Robert giving testimony from memory, and that might be cross-faded with some of the original footage of the camera seemingly in a car, the car-like motion going down a lane or a road, or some of the footage from these race films. Or there was a point where he's talking and the voice carries on, but it cuts to another image of him from the same interview, but just taking a minute, that sort of thing, but his voice from what would have been the same recording is carrying on elsewhere. So it's sort of drawing attention to its own construction sometimes as well. There's a lot going on with memory, there's a lot to do with memory and testimony, and are there tensions between those and historical fact, and how do you get truths out there when there's denial of truth? Well, I've talked quite a lot about that now, and I am quite curious about Edie as well, because I'm wondering, because I've seen this film that's about these revolutionary women, and these were women who were trying to use their democratic voice. They were trying to get access to having a democratic voice and then trying to use it. They were doing everything through the proper channels. They were writing to the governors, the congressmen, they were writing to the press, they were making these films, they were talking to people. They never used violence or direct action. It was always non-violent action they were using. I think Edie's probably a very different film. It's a fiction and it's about, I presume, a white middle class woman, but she's had a hard run of it from what I gather from the trailer, and so maybe you could fill us in and then we'll see what we think.
Okay, so we have to grab the big lever now that switches us from documentary to fiction. Crank that one down. Okay, so we're in fiction mode. Let me just take through it. Edie is Edith Moore. It's probably made quite clear at some point in the film how old she actually is at the time of the drama, but I didn't get that anyway. So she's 83, as we find from the blurb on IMDb. What happens is, very early on in the film, the husband who she's caring for, because he's had a stroke, which means he can't talk or walk, uses stair lifts and wheelchairs, and she has to feed him. He dies after a little bit of a kind of a downward spiral of her just remaining in the same house and just letting the place get, because she no longer has to clean it, she no longer has to care for someone, she just lets it go. After a bit of that, she has to sell the house, and arrangements are made for her to move into a care home, and she does, but then very quickly she decides that she's going to go to Scotland, because when she was young, her dad used to take her on lots of outdoor adventures, and this stuff only becomes clear quite a lot later in the film when she tells various people stories about her own childhood. It becomes clear that the relationship with this guy that she was married to for 40 years, it seems, was one in which he was threatening and bullying. Well, of course, we only ever see this guy virtually immobile in the first few minutes of the film, just before his character dies. He was controlling, he was bullying, but she just never told anyone. So it becomes clear a little later, during the kind of aftermath of his death part of the film, that the marriage was really unhappy because her daughter, who's, I think, herself past 50, she finds a diary that Edie kept during the marriage, and it's just every day she just sits down and writes just 2 or 3 sentences. She just has to tell somebody what it's like. She just tells the diary, and when the daughter finds out about this, she gets really resentful. That's the first of a kind of trail of breadcrumbs that makes it apparent just how much of Edie's life she feels has been completely wasted. And then there's a lot of drama to do with her just looking at a postcard that her dad sent her during her marriage to this guy who died. It's a postcard of a mountain called Sullivan in the northeast of Scotland. It's pronounced Sullivan, but spelled Suilvan. The postcard, the dad had been there without her and sent the postcard saying, let's go there together one day. And it was a really oddly shaped mountain. It's the kind of, the icon is that there's this really oddly shaped mountain that she wants to go up. So there's lots of her getting this postcard out and looking at it, and lots of her getting out really old camping stuff that's up in her loft, and seemingly toying with the idea, and then just seems to bite the bullet, and with virtually no notice gets a sleeper train up to Inverness. And the fact that it's a sleeper train is kind of part of the adventurousness of the whole thing. Arrives in Inverness. In the station is knocked over by this young couple who are running through the station trying to catch a train. It's the woman in the couple who needs to catch the train. She seems to care a lot less than the guy does. The guy's just there to see her off. Anyway, the guy helps Edie. She's okay, but the guy helps her. His name's Johnny. It turns out that he's from the town that she's going to anyway, so he gives her a lift there. And then she stays at a local hotel, and it's quite clear that she's got this very old camping stuff, this plan to go up this mountain, and that's it. She doesn't have any relatively new mountaineering gear. He works at a local mountaineering shop, and he has seemingly done guiding for people wanting to do mountaineering before. So an arrangement's arrived at where it's actually one of his mates that kind of sets it up. It's a bit of a swindle to try and get a lot of money out of this old woman who seems like she's never going to make it up this mountain. So they do lots of preliminary going out and practicing stuff before they go up the mountain, and there's lots of her just looking really tired. I'll get to the cinematography and the way that the whole thing is shot. Anyway, so big portion in the middle of the film, and there was a point where a couple of people walked out and I thought, she is going to go up this mountain. The film has promised us she's going to go up this mountain. There's just this huge period of deferral. Then there's a moment she has a kind of crisis and goes, okay, this obviously isn't happening. She and Johnny are initially quite antagonistic, and of course they become better friends. Then it's a matter of some conflicts with Johnny's girlfriend, who comes back up from this trip while he's still up in this village doing this training. There's this antagonism where it becomes clear that Johnny and his girlfriend's relationship is probably quite crap, and it's probably not going to last, and she's getting really worried about how generous he's being to this old woman. It's becoming something that's not profitable anymore, but they're just having a becoming good friends relationship. When she finally leaves to go and start the hike, it's going to be a 3-day up to the top of the mountain hike, so it's a 6-day round trip hike. It's actually the kind of the shots that they keep doing, it kind of suggests that it's probably only a 1-day hike, maybe 2, and that's for her. A fit person could probably easily do it in a day, but of course they have to stretch it out and make it into quite a big narrative. Anyway, so just as they're about to set off with him guiding her to go and do the hike, she seems to bite the bullet, and by this point she's completely kitted up in really new stuff, and the butterfly transformation part is that she gets new stuff. And there's one point that I thought was very fun, because she gets lots of different sorts of jackets. And the thing when you go do lots of outdoor stuff is you have layers of jackets. So you might have quite a thin jacket you wear on top of your base layer, which is to keep you warm. And then you might have a thicker jacket that goes on top of that, but then you might swap that for a jacket that's also thin, which is waterproof. So you have, it's all very layery. So she's got these layers of stuff. But her top layer is kind of turquoise, at least on her top half, and so are her eyes. So there seems to have been a bit of, okay, we're going to the mountaineering store, but we're still going to think about colour. We're still going to think about whether these colours are actually her. The clothes she kind of rocks up in at the beginning, they're kind of very, very clearly not her. She's just brown, but then kind of ends up in these really kind of colourful mountaineering clothes. The whole film is very loving of outdoor gear. Anyway, so she's all ready to go, she's kitted up, and she can do this walk, but just as they're about to leave, she goes, actually, no, I'm going to do this on my own. You're not coming with me. By that point, Johnny's kind of really, really stressed about this. He's been saying, okay, you can do this, even though you're quite old. You can do this as long as I'm with you. You're capable of doing this with me at your side. And then suddenly she's going, I'm doing it on my own, and he gets really worried. And he kind of agrees, okay, fine. Stuffs his own phone into her pocket, saying, I'll phone you frequently. And then, of course, because it's quite clearly been set up in advance that it's going to be a 3-day thing, there's going to be a 3-stage journey for her to get up the mountain. So we're going to get you, this is the home straight structure is these 3 days. First day, fine. She even manages to row herself across a loch, which was part of the plan. Although there's this one moment when she's trying to launch the boat and it looks like she doesn't have the strength to get the boat launched into the loch. And this woman just appears from nowhere. And she's probably, I'm going to mess this one up here. She's either Dutch or Danish. And she's very young and very active and fit looking and very confident and very nice. She looks a little bit worried that this woman is going up on her own, but then just goes, okay, fine, good luck, and leaves. So it's one of these kind of just a stranger arrives and then a stranger departs moments. Which I suppose reflects a thing which tends to happen when you're outdoors, is you have these moments of you might just spend a few minutes with a person you'll never see again for the rest of your life. Second day, much worse. Weather gets really horrible. End of the day, like her tent blows away. It gets really bad. But through a moment which seems to be, this is the darkest moment, something kind of slightly supernatural happens, and she makes it through the night, and indeed wakes up quite refreshed and well fed and warm and dry. And then the third day is she's actually going up the slope of the mountain. Those first 2 days is just getting to the base of the mountain. Third day, she's going up the slope of the mountain. This has all been set up beforehand as being the hardest bit. It's not just steep climbing, it's like quite a lot of scrambling as well. And the footage of her scrambling up that mountain, I felt Sheila Hancock's extreme bone fatigue at that point. She's a fantastic performer. And then gets to a point where she's basically maybe half an hour's walk from the summit. She gets to that point where it starts to level out. It's very easy, last little bit when you go up a mountain. And then just goes, okay, so this is the point where I can rest. She just kind of lies down on this slope and it looks like she dies.
Oh no.
And of course, over the course of this past day, from that really wet previous night, the film's also been cross-cutting to Johnny getting really worried about her, and he's decided to just go, no, screw it, I'm going to go up the mountain and save her. And he arrives on this third day when the weather's actually improved and everything, and she's just lying there.
Oh no, having a rest.
Yeah, and she's dumped her bag by that point already, so it's just her in boots and outdoor gear, nothing else, no tent, no bag, no walking sticks. And he comes upon her, and there's this slightly comic moment where he goes up to feel her carotid pulse, and he just touches her face and she comes awake, and he goes, oh, thank God. Then she has to deliver that speech because he goes, okay, look, you've done enough. This is obviously completely taking it out of you. This may be dangerous if you want to go any further. And she goes, look, if I could go back and change things about my life, I'd change nearly everything. I've wasted so much of my life. And that's one of the most heartfelt delivered scenes that I've seen in a while. She says, there's no way I'm going down this mountain now. I'm going up to the top of this mountain. And you can see the concern in his face. And Johnny, played by a guy called Kevin Guthrie, who looks like a young Jason Isaacs.
Oh.
Slightly evil eyes. He has that moment of, I've been persuaded by the hero at the last moment. And he goes, okay, yeah, fine. I won't try and stop you, but I am helping you to the top of this mountain. So she's done most of it on her own, but he helps her at that last little bit. And they get to the top, and it's a wonderfully clear moment. It's coming up to sunset, so there's a slight edge of danger. Like, are they going to get down the mountain before the sun goes down? Or are they going to have to somehow camp on top of this mountain? But that's not what the film is really fussed about, because the film just ends something like a minute after she gets to the top of the mountain.
Really?
That's it, yeah. It's just, she gets to the top, she puts this little stone on the cairn, that's a thing. There's lots of these panoramic shots, and her looking completely elated, and him standing off at a respectful distance while she does this thing at the top of the mountain, and then it ends.
I suppose it has to. The only ways down after that. And that's harder. I think down is harder than up.
Yeah. We're not very well built for downs. Right?
No, it's really difficult. So that would have been the challenge, is when you're already exhausted, going back down again.
Yeah. I did Ben Nevis in a day. This is the tallest mountain in the whole of the British Isles, right? I did it in a day. The coming down bit, that was really hard. Because even though at some points you could basically jump down the mountain, my legs had finished walking for the day at the top of that mountain. Needed that bit at the end of that day. I think in part because of that decision to go, she's made it to the top, okay, everyone go home now, there was a slight subtext of her symbolically dying at the moment of reaching the top of the mountain.
Well, you reached your peak.
Yeah.
Where else can your life go? You've done this massive thing. So it does seem like it's completely symbolic. And I was thinking about it earlier because I was thinking about the two films and reading a bit around them. They're very different things that these women have experienced, and yet they're both related to patriarchal abuse. Both of them have really singular experiences which are part of much bigger narratives of abuses towards women. I suppose specifically male violence towards women, and violence that includes psychological or emotional violence as well. And of course it's not exclusive as a male versus female, but it's the dominant structure, and women being believed is such a difficult thing. With Recy Taylor, racial discrimination is so very clearly part of it, but I was wondering, was there much age discrimination, or how much was the age of the character an issue? Were people just treating her like a silly old woman? Were people treating her as if her life's over and she's nothing, she's invisible because she's old?
There's a couple of very overt instances of young local women in this little Scottish town scoffing at Edie just for being around, not for trying to do this walk, just for being in the pub where they all go, the whole village goes of an evening, and being that old. So there's some quite overt moments, but then there was also several covert equivalents, including the moment when Edie, she's not yet arranged the Johnny's going to be my guide thing yet. She goes to the outdoor shop where he works. She thinks she's got all the stuff that she's got is completely sufficient. This is stuff that she's got from her own dad. And when we see a single photo of her with her dad's wearing his Second World War uniform. So she goes into this outdoor store and she's got this stuff, and she goes, I just need a new buckle for my rucksack. She also needs some gas for a camp stove, and she gets the camp stove out of the rucksack. So this is all this old stuff she's got that's obviously very precious to her, none of which she actually takes up the mountain because she gets replaced a bit later. Anyway, so she's in the store, and it's really clear to Johnny, who's working in the store at that point, and his mate, who's also working in the store, that this may be somebody who they can take for every penny she's got. And that's when they come up with the plan of Johnny will train you for these 3 days and then be your guide going up the mountain. And so how much is that altogether? Well, that's 800 quid. Johnny's mate is completely fine with setting this up and persuades Johnny that he ought to go along with this and be the guide and do this training in advance. And so that initial text is people trying to take this old woman for every penny she's got. And of course the whole narrative arc is Johnny, at least, who's constantly expressing his dissatisfaction with his hometown. He regards it as the worst place to live. It's him being braver about saying to people, no, that's wrong, that's mean. And there's several different levels in which this film implicitly criticises these hidebound, parochial, relatively rural Scots. And one of them is through how much they drink. Because I've never seen Whiskey Galore, but I know one of the techniques that's used in Whiskey Galore to criticise the demon drink is having wide-angle lens extreme close-ups that make whatever it's shooting look kind of deformed. And they did the same thing with all the stuff happening in this pub. There was lots of people pouring drinks, either pouring draft beer or pouring whiskey out of a bottle, shot in extreme close-up, canted framings, extreme high-angle shots with these extreme close-ups to make the act of pouring a drink look oddly alien and quite threatening. So there's lots of that in this one night when Edie's out at this pub with Johnny. It's kind of an evening which goes, these Scots are, all of whom are being quite cold towards Edie. They're all living in a kind of rotten culture where drink is not the thing anyone should be touching right now, and yet it's the thing they're all bathing in. There are several different ways Edie was positioned as somebody who was being discriminated against because of her age, and who, when she was young, had been regarded as not really a full human because of being a woman. And the fact of her having kept this diary, and then after her husband dies, the daughter finding it, and then having the daughter not want to hear it, the daughter just walk away when she reads it. That, I suppose, is another little touch that goes, it's a societal issue that women are not permitted to speak up about being unhappy in marriage. What we might expect in that situation is for the daughter to go, oh mum, I had no idea, give me a hug, come here, let's sit down, let's have a cup of tea. You'd expect that kind of reconciliation between daughter and mother moment. If you were to find that your own parent had never wanted to be a parent, you might go, okay, this is earth-shattering, but you'd also feel that parent's pain, wouldn't you? You'd go,
well, especially if you were that old, you were an adult and you'd learnt a few things about life. So the daughter's in, you say, about 50, maybe older than that. Surely you've been around the block a few times by then and you'd have a bit more empathy. But then maybe it's this particular time and place, because it's that generation in the 50s and 60s that, well, how do you say this diplomatically? They're the difficult demographic at the moment. The ones where the bulge of the Leave voters is, and where the Conservative voters are, and the baby boomers who haven't been as affected by the major financial problems of the last 10 years. They maybe haven't had to face a lot of things that somebody of Edie's generation and subsequent generations are facing, so maybe because of their ignorance they're just not really interested in. So maybe maybe it seems like possibly there's generational ignorance is part of institutionalized, well, is it? No, it's not institutionalized. It's part of, what would you call it?
Habituated?
Habituated, just really ground in abuse.
Just as an aside, we know that these are gross generalisations, and not all people in their 50s and 60s are necessarily on the right wing and not necessarily embroiled in abuse and structures of abuse. It's just, this is the number crunching that's happening for that demographic at the moment. That's really where I'm coming from, to try and figure out a little bit of a film I haven't seen. So do forgive the ramblings.
And I suppose if there's financial abuse going on as well, then maybe there's criticism of capitalism and capitalist systems there too. It sounds like a sort of film that's got #NotAllMen on it as well, because this guy Johnny sounds like he's trying to be good, he's potential to be good, and that Edie's father was probably a good man, and something's happened, something's gone wrong. She's been part of a generation that had to get married off, presumably, or that this guy seemed quite nice. And interestingly, because there were so many films on this weekend, it was really difficult to choose what to go and see, and On Chesil Beach is out at the moment, and it seems to be that kind of story where there's this couple who are wildly in love, and then it gets to their wedding night and things are not really okay, because the young bride is really quite scared, doesn't really know what. I don't know that much about it actually, but I think that she doesn't really know what sex is. She's not ready, and I think the husband's quite forceful, is what I'm getting from what I've heard about it so far. So it's along those lines, and it's that, well, of that more traditional age where you don't actually have anything physical to do with each other until your wedding night. It's such a massive thing, and that it could be, maybe that's how it is with the Edie character with her husband. Maybe it was, he seemed fine, and then once they were married, that was that. He started being this controlling monster, and of course you only see him as this frail, immobilised being in need of help until the inevitable end. But it's interesting as well, the idea that, well, she's put in a care home and resists it.
There's very little of the film is spent showing us anything about the care home, but there's this one little scene where the first day when she arrives, she joins this flower arranging group and is given a bunch of flowers and some scissors and told to be careful, the scissors are very sharp, because we need to be told that scissors are sharp, it seems. So great little moment of her having these flowers plonked in front of her and some scissors, and she just picks one of them up and just snips the head off a rose and then puts the scissors down, and that's it. That's the end of her flower arranging. The film was great for, this person has no pleasures in life at the beginning, and that continues for quite some time, even though, every now and then she's going to Scotland, seeing some really wonderful views out the windows of the train. It kind of starts at a slow drip, and then when she gets her outdoor kit, that's when the floodgates are open. She suddenly starts to experience all these wonderful sensations about existing in the world. Like, I think what happened was, the script was written by Elizabeth O'Halloran and was directed by Simon Hunter, based on an idea by Edward Lyndon Bell. Okay. Now, I don't know any of these three names, which is shameful. But whichever one of them had that input into it, obviously it had a wonderful experience with buying outdoorsy stuff, and it had opened a whole new world to them. So from that moment onwards, there's this, her just suddenly enjoying being in the world. So just the simple act of getting a bit tired from doing a physical job, the simple act of rowing. They do a bit of fishing at one point. So there's all still just the training part. She drinks cider out of a can. That bit kind of ends up in the trailer, I think. She drinks cider out of a can and she gets quite squiffy as a result. They barbecue food outside. Just the act of her putting tent pegs in the ground, that's shot really lovingly. And the sound design is layered on to make things make quite loud sounds relative to what we'd normally expect them to make. So Johnny's car, for example, is just Flintstones mechanical. It's like someone went, how are we going to do the noises of Johnny's car? Well, I'll just get a Foley artist to just bang bits of metal with bits of wood. And that's going to be the noise of Johnny's car. So all these thunking, clanging sounds. There's the rain, the simple action of putting a gas canister into the stove that you used to make tea. These things are really lovingly done. And these are quite big sounds as well. And at the same time, that's all shot with relatively shallow depth of field lenses. Lots of very handheld close-ups, particularly of bits of Sheila Hancock's body interacting with things. So if she's just really loving being outside and hearing the wind, we get an extreme close-up of her ear and then maybe the sun's behind it. So there's lots of that. I could just film this person from 20 feet away against this huge landscape. But no, I'm going to have cameras really up and around Sheila Hancock's body. But then in addition, there are these landscape shots, but quite a lot of them are moving in some way. And of course, the film makes quite liberal use of drones, because there's places where you just couldn't get a helicopter or a crane, and a drone just has this angel ability to move around the landscape. So there's times when I go, oh, there's a shot that's above shoulder height. I wonder at what point in the next 20 seconds that shot's going to rocket up into the air, making all characters seem like tiny ants. So yeah, it was it wasn't a love story to any particular part of Scotland. The Scottishness of it was not particularly important. It was just, it's a part of the British Isles which is outdoors. It was a love story to a place where there is no human presence. A lot of it was around water as well, because this is a mountain near the sea. The big view she gets from the top of the mountain is the view out across the sea. There's her rowing, lots and lots of rain involved. And one of the training days they have a barbecue next to a loch, and so she's just kind of enamoured with all this. And Johnny, because he's grown up there, he doesn't really find any of this stuff interesting anymore. He kind of regards the entire place as quite boring, so he, through her, rediscovers his love of the environment. Now, do you want me to tell you about the slightly supernatural bit?
Okay.
So it's the end of the second day. It's raining like crazy. Tension's getting quite intense. There's lots of cross-cutting between her and Johnny back in the town looking really concerned. Music's really intense, and the music composed by Debbie Wiseman. Really emotive soundtrack. And I know people can go, the soundtrack was telling me what to feel. That's fine. That's completely fine. Do tell me what to feel. Do just make me feel it. That's quite fine as well. You can really fill me up. And there was, at the point when two people walked out of the auditorium, I thought, okay, I know it's a bit slow-paced at the moment, but this film is promising you things. There's never been any point at which there hasn't been a real thickness of feeling in this film. And they didn't come back. So, second day, things are getting intense. It's dark. Her tent blows away. She kind of staggers into a wood where the rain is still getting in through the trees, and she collapses. And you can see Johnny's already left at this point. He's trying to make his way up the mountain to go and help. She's not answering the phone that he gave her because it's in her bag, and she's left her bag somewhere. And then after a bit of just being collapsed and seemingly dazed in the woods, she gets up and sees a light, and there's just a little moment where Johnny's got a torch, so it seems for just a moment that she's seen his torch and like, wow, and Johnny's going to rescue Edie. But no, it's the light of a fire, and she follows the light. I think allusions here are being made to, probably not urban myths, these mountaineering myths that circulate amongst outdoorsy people about odd things that happen when you're in the outdoors. It's often referred to as being pixie-led. It might just be that you just get all kind of turned around or disoriented, and you end up somewhere you didn't expect to be. And rather than saying, I just got turned around and disoriented, you might say, I was pixie-led, and that's how I ended up there. Anyway, so she sees this fire off in the distance, and she makes her way towards it, and she finds this cabin, really old, there's holes in the ceiling. But for some reason, there's a log fire burning in this cabin. There's even candles in these little sconces in the walls. And there's two beds that have been just rags, rugs, I suppose, on the floor, or animal skins on the floor, and some tartan rugs that have all been laid out, and so she seems to just go, oh, someone obviously knew I was coming and got this fire ready for me. So she's all dazed because of this, and she basically collapses and falls asleep, and then wakes up a little bit later, and this guy comes in, and there's lots of, is it Johnny? Did Johnny get it ready? But no, it's not. He seems to be a hunter, and he's got rabbits over his shoulder, and he's really hairy, he's really dirty, he's really big, never says a word, comes in, puts these rabbits down, notices that she's there, looks just a tiny bit dazed for a moment, and then just takes it all in his stride. So puts more logs on the fire, just makes sure that she's warm, can see that this is a woman who poses him no threat, clearly. Then she dozes off almost instantly because she's exhausted, wakes up in the morning, he's taken her clothes, hung them up on this line so that they can dry out, he's made her some porridge, just brings her some porridge and some tea, never says a thing. And there's not much more in that scene. It's not clear whether he's there when she leaves, but she leaves, and she leaves the little tiny postcard that her dad had sent her in that little place. It's partly showing her making new relationships in extreme circumstances that are very much unlike the ones she's left behind, but also showing her shedding the last few bits of that earlier life, even including the bits that she liked, which included her relationship with her dad, so she's kind of laid that dad thing to rest. And then she leaves and she continues on up the mountain, and there's nothing about this trapper hunter guy at all for the rest of the film. It kind of fits with the law, L-O-R-E, law, of being outdoorsy, that these huge swathes of completely predictable, very brutal, you're just up against reality time, and then these little tiny moments of, did I dream that? Kind of experiences happening. That paper that it was, who was it? British Silent Film Festival Symposium.
Yeah, do you mean, is it Liz Watkins on the Explorer films? Is that what you mean?
And she was talking about the records that the explorers had kept about optical phenomena they noticed in the Arctic, and that it was, or the Antarctic, and that these were completely unexpected aspects of their time doing something that was otherwise tremendously boring. You just get these little slivers of, oh, I didn't expect that would happen. So, you know, when you might be going up a mountain and it's just raining constantly, and then for no reason at all the sky clears and it's just burningly hot for the rest of the day. That moment when you suddenly realise you're not going to be wet for the entire day, a little tiny glimmer of, oh, that's great. So you get bits of that. I'd say it's something like 3 films all kind of layered onto each other. One is a film where someone, maybe it was Simon Hunter, went, I want to make a film with a very limited cast, which is about the tangible aspects of being in the world. I want to take my camera and I just want to stick it as close to Sheila Hancock as possible while she shows what it feels like to be quite old in strenuous circumstances. So that's layer number 1. Layer number 2 is I want to do a film about whether it's ever too late. And that moment when she's in the care home does seem to suggest, yes, it's too late. And then there's even later moments as well where it looks like she just doesn't have what it takes to get up the mountain, and that seems to suggest, yes, it's too late. But then, of course, the climax is, no, it's not. And then the third layer underneath that is someone just going, I just want to do a love poem to mountains. Not to Scotland, not to mountaineering, just to mountains themselves. Although I suppose actually, how would you experience mountains if not through going up them? So I suppose it's a love poem to mountains and what it's like to go up them. So altogether, layers which fit neatly with each other. The only weakness I'd point out is some of the dialogue seemed to be unclear about what stances people were taking relative to each other and whether they were disagreeing or not. There was just a couple of moments where the dialogue was a bit unclear on this, but apart from that, it was just really coherent. It was really well shot, cinematography great, music worked really well with it, pace fine. Those 2 people who left clearly wouldn't agree. It was slow in the middle, but having a nice slow middle is relevant to an end which is going to be quite tense. So as a piece of fiction, yeah, I'm sure I would have enjoyed seeing Solo: a Star Wars story, but this was definitely worth it. Talking about fiction where you have so much control over every element of what you shoot, including being able to persuade Sheila Hancock to probably do most of the things that her character was doing. You've put yourself in a position where you can be criticised or praised for almost every element that's in the film. When we're talking about a documentary, it's nowhere near that, is it? It's a lot of what you're dealing with is this kind of raw, unyielding rock of an object. And so in a lot of cases, you're pre-screwed before you start making the documentary. Recy Taylor, I know we don't tend to make these judgments about quality, but what did you think?
It was beautifully made. It was a really intricately woven story. It's put across in such a straightforward way. You're given a lot of information. It's like a patchwork quilt where it's been a huge amount of thought and research and placing of things and trying out of things, it does reveal itself sometimes, and not in a way that's become possibly quite trite and predictable now with a lot of documentaries that like to be reflexive and show their own construction. It's more subtle than that. It's more, there are artifacts here and I'm going to show you lots of them. There's layerings, there's slippages of fiction with the testimony and with testimony from the historians from their research, which of course is built on a lot of testimony as well as records. I mean, it's very capably layered. From a technical standpoint, I couldn't see a single fault. I was fully engaged from start to finish. The images used were beautiful. The cinematography was really, really thoroughly considered. There was a lot of quite floating, ghostly camera work. There was a lot of drifting on the roads and in the woodlands where the rape may have happened, and including really haunting and very beautifully shot, I think they probably were drone shots of a completely top down bird's eye view over treetops in winter time. So the trees were quite scraggly and leafless, but filmed on quite a sunny day, and the grass is patchy but green, and so you're getting the browns, the yellows, the greens, you're getting these colours, but yet the starkness of the leafless tree branches and seeing the patchy ground. You're hearing the different people telling the story, telling Recy's story. It's actually a very long time before you hear her voice. You know, it's actually a lot of people telling her story on her behalf as she told it for them. And when she does speak, because her voice is in it and there's a lot of recordings, and when Danielle Maguire was researching her book, there's actually some amateur footage of them meeting and talking. They're both noticeably younger in this footage when they're talking. It's possible that some of the voice that you hear of Recy sometimes is from that, or it could be from something else when she's on camera in more contemporary footage and she's in her care home, because there's quite a long time before there's revealed. There's loads of photographs of her as a young woman, and it's after the event, and she has this haunted look on her face and her body language is rigid. It changed her forever, of course. That look is still in her face. It's haunted, but it's determined. She's not going to be beaten, she's defiant. So you see her from behind initially, the grey hair, then it's apparent she's in a wheelchair, and then she's been taken into her room and she's been taken out of the wheelchair and put in her chair in her room, and she's wearing the most glorious bright royal blue blazer, really fab jewellery. She looks fierce, I think is the technical term. She's in her late 90s at this point. This is filmed, I imagine, not that long before she died. She still has that look in her eyes that she has in the photograph taken of her when she's in her 20s, and this has just happened to her. She has that same haunted but yet determined and defiant look in her eyes. She says very little, or at least very little of what she says in that time and space is included, but she says, all I can do is tell the truth. I have to tell the truth. This is what she's still doing all these years later. This is 70 odd years later, she's still telling her truth. It's really powerfully done. The storytelling is done really well. It's mostly her younger brother who starts off telling the story, his brother and her sister. It unfolds. I suppose it's like a blooming flower. It just starts to unfold and reveal itself. You get more and more details as you go. There's no doubt in anybody's mind that what she says happened is what happened. It's timely because in the past year we've had the Me Too movement, we've had I Believe Her hashtags on Twitter. I mean, even just a matter of weeks ago I was following the rugby rape trial back home in Belfast. Women are still being failed by the justice system. There's no justice in the justice system for women who have been raped because there's apparently no evidence for conviction, even though, and interestingly, this is something that when there's actors reading the voices of the boys' testimonies, there's lots of different shots of the courthouses, there's shots of the transcripts of this, on the original paper, but there's also shots around the woodland, including things like, because one of them says we all wore rubbers. There's one shot where it's the leafy ground and there's a used condom lying in it, things like that. This is 1944. It didn't have the forensics that we have now, but you wonder, is this conveniently disappeared even now? How easily can this, because even just that, they wouldn't have been clearing that up after themselves. If they had been using condoms, they probably would have just thrown them on the ground. There would be evidence that something happened, but nobody's interested enough to go and look for any evidence. So the film visually fills in a lot of gaps. It visualises quite a lot. It leaves little to the imagination because this is something that you cannot say. Precisely what happened, you cannot say. I mean, just the fact that in the reportage the word ruptured was used, the violence of the visual images that you imagine that are triggered by that word is really very disturbing. And then her sister very pointedly says she never had any more children, never. But it's left for you to wonder what happened. Was her body too broken? Was she not able to have children after that night? Was it that she couldn't be touched again by her husband? It could be any number of things, but there's a lot that's unsaid. There's a lot that's told to you, but there's a lot that's unsaid. So actually, the images that you're seeing from these race films, it's images of a woman wearing a white dress, running away from something and trying to run towards safety and not being able to find safety. I think there were so many of these cases and they weren't allowed to be talked about. These people were bought off. They were written off as whores and they were too scared to talk because lynchings were happening regularly. The KKK was rising. People were in fear of their lives and in fear of their families. And as I said earlier, Recy spoke up, and a few days later she and her husband were burnt out of their house. They had a 9-month-old baby. These people showed them no mercy, and she'd been a victim of something. Somebody would be describing how she was trying to run, but she was warned not to run because they threatened to shoot her. She was advised to go with them, to try to talk with them, to just survive it, basically, was what she was advised to do by other people who were there. But there was a moment where somebody was describing her trying to run and her running a particular direction and coming up against a fence and she had nowhere to go. And what you're seeing is this really old black and white footage from one of the race films where it's something like that is what you're seeing, is this young woman in a vulnerable position at night time trying to run through woodland and coming up against the fence in a panic, running back the way she came. And a lot of these films were much older, were from the 20s, the 30s. It seemed like quite a lot of them were responses to Birth of a Nation. I think the earliest was from 1920, a silent film, and there were ones from 39. There was one of the scholars talked about them a bit because they seem to have found these things and using them as artifacts because this was the only way that people had of telling their stories. They had to get them out there somehow, and mainstream avenues would not listen at all. They were getting into local papers, but nationally everybody just kept writing into the newspapers, writing these films and finding ways of getting them made. Community efforts. I'm quite interested actually to look into these films and the history of them because I didn't know they existed and they're so important. There's one really disturbing one that was shown that was a family being chased down by a mob of white men and running down the man and putting a noose around his neck. They're so concerned with tearing the woman's clothes off her that they don't notice the child slipping out of his noose and running off. Really just disturbing, horrific things, and you think, gosh, these films got made because they weren't mainstream. They weren't coming up against the Hays Code. They were able to make the stories as the truth as they saw them because they needed to tell their stories, and there was a hunger for that because they were being whitewashed out of mainstream cinema. One of the scholars was talking about the legacy of slavery, things that we're only really now seeing emerging in the mainstream in very recent years. Films like The Help, where the white solution to raising children was the black help, the black maids were doing it for you. They were raising the white children. So there's a lot of photographs of that, of the one black woman in a family photograph of white people, all of the black women who were in the background who were raising these people, and then these people were growing up to rape black women. It was really quite disturbing, this continuing cycle from the legacy of slavery, that these women weren't people, they were just these things to be used for your own pleasure. It's probably an interesting pair of films to have been thinking about. With Edie, this is a depiction of a person who has not had a happy life, has had quite an oppressive life, but at the same time has probably, you assume, lived a fairly middle class life in, is it the south of England?
It's really vaguely
Just England
located,
somewhere.
but yeah, somewhere in England. Although it is pointed out that he was a total stinge with money, and they do live in a very small house. As for class status, she's not impoverished, but
She's not wealthy either.
see, the thing is, when it comes to the body of the film, and she's gone to Scotland, she's staying in a hotel, it shows that she gets a great big pile of money out from somewhere she's hidden it in the house.
Right.
So it may be that she was saving money across her entire life because she wasn't allowed to spend any of it when she was married. As for class status, not sure, but even if you're only earning a little bit of disposable income, if you're not permitted to spend it by your abusive partner and therefore have to hide it, I don't know, I suppose wouldn't he have gone, I need to see it, you need to put it into this account. It was all very unspecified, but anyway, yeah, the house is tiny, so maybe working class, but hardly below the poverty line.
But she has enough social mobility to just get on a train to Scotland and go and stay in a hotel and buy all this new modernised stuff, you know, and become herself.
A lot of it is she doesn't have the confidence to do it, but she just did it anyway.
That's a woman who has the ability to take ownership, even very late in life, but to take ownership and to just go and do that, to have that sort of mini one-person revolution, and yet still ends up being reliant on a man. And it's not that she's reliant on him, he makes himself indispensable to her. Even if it's well-intentioned, there's still a controlling force there. She gets a kind of justice to a degree, she gets a freedom to a degree, but it comes at some sort of a price as well.
It's quite neatly handled at the end where he's saying, look, please, no one's going to judge you, you've done amazingly, you've given all you can give, you've got this far, just for the sake of safety, let's go now. And she goes, no, I'm going to finish this, I'm going up this mountain. So even though that little bit of the walk she doesn't do alone, and she does it with his help, it's her choice, it's her decision. Okay, fine, I'm going up this mountain, I'm not going down now.
That she's in a position where men will just unquestioningly help her shows that it's such a massive difference. Whereas with Recy's story, I mean, her story just gets more and more tragic actually, because her marriage breaks down much later and her daughter is killed in a car accident. She was never able to have any more children and lives a long life. And she had a very hard life. She was a sharecropper, I think it's called. She was an orange picker as well, you know, so she had a physically hard life and all this tragedy in her life after having given up a lot of her own adolescence to raise her younger siblings as well after their mother died, and never had justice for what happened to her. Just this measly apology, much too late. And was really quite obscure until this academic research shed light on her. Again, you have to read between the lines between what is said very explicitly by the academic historians who happen to be women, and one of them happens to be a black woman, and the amateur historian who is a local white Alabama man who says frustrating things like, well, you know, I'm a historian so I have to take a neutral stance and stuff. I don't think historians do that. I don't think there's any such thing as a neutral.
The least he could do is say, I have to try to, and admit that he might not be able to.
So it feels like there's such a difference there in how far, you know, an English white woman can reclaim part of her life.
The overlap is minimal.
Yeah, But I think it's an interesting thing how the fight continues into old age. I suppose even on that level, it's probably useful. It was really amazing actually to see things like they point out, because there's a little bit of Martin Luther King in there as well. It's a moment where he was talking about Rosa Parks, standing up for her right to be on that bus and prevailing. And then the historians are pointing out it's always all about Martin Luther King. They point out that when you watch the rallies that he was speaking at, all the massive speeches he gave, and you get those reverse shots from the crowd and the sea of women sitting there, and they say, we've been here, they've always been here, they're always going to be there. They're always going to be fighting this battle because it's not over yet, and they've always been doing it. These women are falling into obscurity and his name is remembered, but they're doing this history that gives their lives meaning. So I felt by the end elated, you felt strong. It was incredible having that more recent footage of Recy in her home and how much she's survived, how much she's been through, and she lived to 98. Thanks so much to all our listeners. If you can support the podcast or would like more information on the development of the Audiovisual Cultures website and other resources,